Let's go back to 1999 and take a look at a retail chain called Blockbuster. You remember them. Selling videos, rentals, to Americans. Who was the Blockbuster mainstream customer in 1999? They were a 30 to 45-year-old mom, so-called soccer mom, living in the suburbs, husband, 2 kids and a dog, driving a minivan or an SUV, renting VHS tapes at the time, coming to Blockbuster on a Friday or Saturday night, stopping for takeout at the same strip mall or a nearby one as the Blockbuster store. And they were looking for new releases, recent hits that had just come to the store, having been in the theaters several months earlier. Now contrast that with the original Netflix customer. In 1999, Netflix began offering its service to Americans. Who was that original Netflix customer? Were they the same as the mainstream Blockbuster customer? They were not. They tended to be an 18 to 29-year-old male. Where were they living? Many of them in their mother's basement or dorm room. They weren't renting VHS tapes. They were trying out a new technology called DVDs. Were they watching on a flat-screen television? No, they couldn't afford one. They were watching DVDs on a computer, often on a laptop. And they weren't always renting new releases. What were they watching? Old cult classics, independent films, and tried-and-true films like Caddyshack and Star Wars, Monty Python movies, and The Godfather. They weren't necessarily simply watching new releases, as the families often did when mom brought home the latest and greatest hit that had been in theaters just a few months earlier. Now, what's interesting about this is to think about Blockbuster's market research at the time in 1999. They were conducting focus groups and surveys with their mainstream customer. They were asking that soccer mom what she liked and disliked about Blockbuster. And what was her main criticism of Blockbuster stores? She wanted more copies of hit movies. Why? Well, she could recall those instances where little Sally, her 6-year-old, had cried all the way home because Blockbuster didn't have any more copies of Finding Nemo. And the store had posters for weeks saying that on May 1st, Finding Nemo would be hitting the stores and available for rental. So, what did Blockbuster do? They had to offer more copies. So they began to offer their guarantee that they would have available the movies that were just hitting their stores. And so they went from one area, small area of new releases, to an entire wall of new releases in the store. Soon it was multiple walls of the store, the entire perimeter lined with the new releases, sometimes with 50, 60, 70 copies of a particular movie. Well, who's getting more disenchanted with Blockbuster as this is going on? The mom's happy because now little Sally's not crying. But the 18 to 29-year-old male, they're really upset. Now they can't find Caddyshack. Not because some other young man has rented it, but because Caddyshack is no longer available at any Blockbuster store. There's no more room on the shelves for certain old movies because new releases have crowded them out. What's the young male's other big complaint about Blockbuster? Late fees. You remember those. If you didn't return your movie within 48 hours, they whacked you with a fee, sometimes equal to the amount you paid to rent the movie. Why did the young male hate late fees? He didn't have much money. He was an irresponsible young male who wanted to watch the movie 10 times, never leave his basement, and who always forgot to return the movies when they were due. He wanted to watch that movie often. That was key. That was key. He hated the late fees. Now, what's a lesson from this story? The lesson from this story is that Blockbuster was pursuing what we call incremental innovation. They were talking to their customer and offering small improvements in their service, in their in-store experience, in the availability of movies. But along came Netflix with what we call a disruptive innovation, a fundamentally different product and service, in fact, a whole new business model, and it undermined Blockbuster's competitive advantage. Recall that we talked about the main threats to competitive advantage. We said there were 3 main external threats to competitive advantage. The first was imitation, when someone does what you're doing but finds a way to do it better. Then there was substitution, where someone comes along with an alternative product or service that fulfills the same human need. And finally, there was holdup, when either your buyers or your suppliers gain leverage over you and begin to extract more of the profit from the value chain. In many ways, the most serious threat is substitution. And that's what we're seeing here with Netflix, offering really a substitute to the traditional brick-and-mortar store that rented movies to customers. Why is the most serious threat substitution in many cases? It's because it's so hard to foresee, and perhaps it's even harder to respond to, as we will see with Blockbuster. You know, Joseph Schumpeter, the great economist, wrote many years ago about the need to look beyond your direct rivals when thinking about the principal threat to your competitive advantage. He said it is still competition within a rigid pattern of invariant conditions, methods of production, and forms of industrial organization that practically monopolizes attention. But in capitalist reality, as distinct from its textbook picture, it's not that kind of competition which counts, but the competition from the new commodity, new technology, new type of organization. This kind of competition is much more effective than the other, as a bombardment is in comparison with forcing the door. Schumpeter was telling us that, in fact, this threat of substitution comes out of left field and often poses the most serious threat. We have a classic study of this idea of disruptive innovation. In fact, the author who coined this term was a man named Clay Christensen. Clay Christensen had been in the business world for many years and then returned to Harvard Business School to pursue his doctorate in the early 1990s. And he conducted a study for his dissertation on the disk drive industry. And he traced the evolution of that industry from 1976 through 1992, watching as a series of technological innovations came to market and observing what happened to the players in that market. From a technological perspective, the physical size of the disk drive shrank dramatically during that time. Moreover, the cost per megabyte of storage dropped substantially. Well, that was happening from a technology standpoint. What happened in the market? Well, he observed that the incumbent leaders in one generation of technology often were not able to maintain their leadership in the next technological generation. So we saw a new player emerge as the leader in each subsequent evolution of disk drive technology. Now, why was that? What was going on? Well, Christensen argued that the incumbent players were intent on pursuing what he called sustaining or incremental innovation, minor improvements to the attributes that mainstream customers valued. They were doing their market research, listening to those small changes that might enhance customer satisfaction, and implementing them. But what about those disruptive innovators, the people who entered the market and supplanted those leaders? The disruptive innovation was something very different. These innovators were introducing a quite different package of attributes from the ones that mainstream customers typically valued. They often performed significantly worse on certain attributes that the mainstream customers valued a lot. But their performance trajectory was steep for these disruptive innovations. Think about this in terms of Netflix, right? They weren't focused on the attributes that Blockbuster was focused on. They had no stores, so in-store experience, availability of new releases, these were not things they focused on. They performed significantly worse, in fact, on new release availability. Netflix didn't want to be in the new release business. They, in fact, were intent on being in the business of renting older movies. But for doing that, for renting older movies, they came up with an entire new way of doing business. And they performed, initially not so well, but they were on that steep trajectory, improving at a rapid rate. And while Blockbuster took a while to respond, by the time they did respond, Netflix had improved considerably and now was a formidable competitor. Well, you might wonder, why do incumbent firms struggle so much? Why did Blockbuster struggle? Why did the incumbent players in the disk drive industry struggle so much to respond to this disruptive innovation? We'll start with two main reasons that Christensen and his co-author Joseph Bauer articulated in an article in the mid-1990s based on this research. They looked to traditional market research and traditional resource allocation processes within the incumbent firms as sources of the problem. Well, let's take a look at this. First, traditional market research. Every marketing guru tells companies, you must listen to your customers. You must be more customer-centric. Put the customer first. The customer is boss, you hear. But when you ask the customer about your product or service, what type of feedback do you receive? The customer, it turns out, thinks mostly in terms of incremental improvement. The minor adjustments you might make to make them more satisfied, to make them happier. They don't think in terms of totally new ways of doing business. The customer can't see the future in that way in many cases. Steve Jobs said, you don't invent the iPod through a focus group. Steven Spielberg said, you don't come out with a groundbreaking new movie by focus group. So talking to customers is important, but it tends to be good at incremental innovation and not so much at helping you foresee disruptive innovation. But there's another piece that's important here, and that has to do with resource allocation processes. What do we mean by a resource allocation process? Well, every firm has to have some way of deciding how to allocate scarce investment dollars. So they have to have some way of assessing requests for major capital investments. And how do they do that? Well, incumbent firms tend to have rigorous financial practices for doing so. What do they ask for when someone has an idea? They ask for a model. They ask for an estimate of the return on investment. And employees will use financial techniques like discounted cash flow or cost-benefit analysis, ROI techniques, other things to try to understand whether it makes economic sense to pursue this new idea. But think about it for a moment. If you've got an idea that's really out of left field, that's totally new, that's a cutting-edge technology, can you actually do a very sophisticated financial analysis? To do so, you'd have to be able to, with precision, estimate the revenues that you will generate, the size of the market opportunity, the costs of bringing that product or service to market. In a really bleeding-edge technological situation, it's going to be very hard to come up with that kind of precise financial model. So there's a bias built in at incumbent firms. That bias is built in, and it tends to lead to the funding of incremental innovation. Because an incremental innovation is one that's building just as a minor addition off of the existing product or service. As a result, you can be much more precise in estimating the new revenues you'll generate or the cost savings that you will produce by implementing this sustaining innovation. So big firms tend to shuttle their resources toward people who can make a good financial case. And the incremental innovators, well, they can make their case much more effectively than the bleeding edge technological leaders who come in there and have to say, I don't know a lot when trying to represent their cost-benefit analysis. Big firms don't want to hear, I don't know. They don't want to hear, it's uncertain. They want to hear, this is what the benefits and costs will be. And so there's a bias to incremental innovation. There's also a fear at big firms that, well, this new product or service may cannibalize our existing product or service. If we move online at Blockbuster, well, that will take traffic away from our stores. We'll kill the golden goose. We can't do that. So big firms worry about that. They don't want to take revenue away from a product or a service that's been so successful and that's profitable in hopes that this new idea could someday down the road become as profitable. But there's other reasons, why incumbent firms struggle so much with disruptive innovation. Richard Foster was a longtime partner at McKinsey Consulting. He talked about the idea of mindset. And he said, many large firms end up in a situation of what he called mental lock-in. They get stuck in a particular mental model of how you make money in a particular business. And the problem, he said, is disruptive technologies, well, they not only have a different set of product attributes that they're bringing to market, sometimes they have a fundamentally different business model. And the incumbent firm can't wrap their heads around that new business model because they're so used to making money in a certain way. Let's take a look at an example of that. You all remember that at one point in time, Polaroid was a dominant brand in the world in the field of instant photography. They were a longtime leader, not only with a great product, but it was backed by great science and manufacturing and distribution capabilities. Polaroid was built around a deeply held business model. Razors and blades, something that we've talked about. The idea that you got people the camera, you sold it to them at cost, maybe even at a loss. Why? Because once they had that Polaroid camera, they had to buy film, the so-called blades. And they had to buy that film for many years to come. So Polaroid did not make its money on the hardware, on the camera. They made all their money on the film. And it was incredibly lucrative. Now, the story that many have heard is that they simply failed to see the digital revolution, that they were caught completely off guard and they never realized the world was going to move to digital. That's actually not the reality. A case study by Tripsis and Gavetti looks in detail at what happened with the demise of Polaroid. They found that, in fact, substantial research and development activity was taking place, going all the way back to the 1980s in the Polaroid labs. They were working on digital technology, but they were very late coming to market with that technology. Why was that? Was it the scientists' fault? Did they not see the future? Tripsis and Gavetti conclude that it was not. They find, in fact, that there was strong resistance from senior management who did not want to advance the project, did not want to give this new technology, digital cameras, the resources needed to go to market. They were hesitant. Why? They were wedded to an old business model. Let me see if I can explain that. In Tripsis and Gavetti's research, they interviewed someone who worked in the labs on the research and development with regard to digital cameras. And he said at one point, the catch to our product concept was that you had to be in the hardware business to make money. How could you say that? Where's the film? There's no film. So what we had was a constant fight with the senior executive management in Polaroid for 5 years. In other words, what he was saying was the razors and blades model didn't fit with regard to digital technology. Now, there was no film. So now you had to make money off the hardware. You had to generate a strong profit margin from selling the digital camera with no profit to come from the blades, from the film. Well, that new business model didn't fit at all with the way Polaroid had operated for years. And management was stuck. They had a mental lock-in phenomenon taking place. And they couldn't adapt quickly enough, and they didn't allocate the resources to people working on that new technology in their very own research and development laboratories. Netflix, too, was bringing a different business model, not just a different product or service, to market. And here, their business model was dependent on something that Chris Anderson, the former editor of Wired magazine, called the long tail in a great book that he published several years ago. What's the long tail and how does it work? And why was it so different than the traditional Blockbuster model? Well, in Anderson's book, published several years ago, he took a look at the time, the largest brick-and-mortar music retailer in the United States. That was Walmart. And he looked and he said he noticed that they carried about 4,500 unique CD titles, or about 55,000 songs. Moreover, most of the activity in the Walmart store, in their music section, was about the hits. The top 200 albums accounted for 90% of Walmart's music sales at any given point in time. Thus, roughly 5% of the albums on the shelves accounted for 90% of their revenue. Walmart's music business exhibited the usual pattern found in hit-driven businesses before the internet. We see this in books, in movies, in music, entertainment. Businesses in general were hit-driven at the time. But he noticed something rather different when you looked at some of the new emerging technologies of entertainment. He took a look at Rhapsody, a digital music service. They carried more than 1.5 million songs, many, many times greater than the number of songs available at a Walmart store. Moreover, a big chunk of the sales, yes, they were accounted for by the hit songs. The most popular songs definitely drove a big portion of Rhapsody's volume. But Rhapsody also reported that songs ranked as low as number 900,000 on their popularity charts were streamed at least once per quarter. Remember, Walmart only sold 55,000 songs at the time in their stores. Here was Rhapsody, a digital music service, selling many, many more songs, having a huge library available to them. Anderson looked at several different sort of new economy firms and noticed the same phenomenon. At Netflix, 21% of their revenue was generated from movies not available at Blockbuster. Rhapsody, 40% of its revenue generated from music not available in a Walmart store. Amazon, 25% of its revenue in the book business generated from books not available in any Barnes & Noble brick-and-mortar store. The long tail. The idea then that you could generate a lot of revenue from products that were low in popularity, so low that they weren't carried in any of your brick-and-mortar competitors. Well, this was an interesting phenomenon, a whole new possibility for how to make money. And Netflix was capitalizing it. In fact, they didn't want to be in the new release business because that's a difficult business. Yes, you make a lot of money when Finding Nemo first hits the store. But if you need many, many copies in order to please all those soccer moms, what do you do a month later when everyone's watched Finding Nemo? You don't need those copies anymore, and so you have to dump them. you start selling used movies in Blockbuster stores, trying to capture as much revenue as possible from all this excess inventory. Netflix, they didn't want to be in that business. They wanted to be in the long tail. They wanted to sell less popular movies, but movies that were cheap to acquire and that they could hold in a few distribution centers around the country and then ship at the customer's request. What a better model that they could operate if they could avoid having to keep all of that inventory that would soon be obsolete the way it was in Blockbuster stores. So Chris Anderson wrote that traditional retailers made all their money in these entertainment businesses off of the hits, the top 100 or 200 songs or books or movies at any given point in time. Hybrid retailers, people who operated catalogs or online sites, still selling physical goods but not distributing them through brick-and-mortar stores, they could make money off of many more items because they could stock many more items in a distribution center than Walmart or Barnes & Noble could stock in a physical store. But then he said the purely digital retailers, they can make money forever, no matter how low in popularity an item is, because the marginal cost of adding another song to the iTunes or Spotify library was so low, virtually zero. You could make any song available even if there was only one customer out there who wanted that song. Purely digital retailers could make money on a wide array of products in a way brick-and-mortar retailers simply could not. And Netflix, as they moved to streaming, they could do that. No longer were they simply a hybrid retailer offering physical products online. With the streaming revolution, they could offer any movie they wanted to any customer, and the cost of putting that movie up was very low in terms of that marginal cost of adding an additional movie. But what drove demand for these non-hits? How do you get people to rent a movie that's not a major hit in the theaters? How do you create demand from the customer? Well, you do it in a whole new way. What Anderson noted was the traditional way that you got people to go to the theaters to see Finding Nemo or rent it at a Blockbuster store, or the traditional way that you might get them to listen to a new song from Taylor Swift or Brad Paisley. Well, you used mass marketing. But in this new world, Anderson said, now you saw social networking, customer reviews, playlists, blogs, other forms of social media, driving demand for niche products, products that you could never justify running a mass marketing campaign for. But now you could target and find the people who liked that particular genre, and you could offer them some new information via social media about that and get them to then come to your service and purchase it. But even beyond that, what Netflix did in bringing a new business model to the table was build algorithms, sophisticated statistical algorithms that used information they were collecting about the customer to create customized recommendations. So that when you logged on to the Netflix site, they would tell you, here's a movie you may never have heard of, but we think you will like, based on people like you, based on your history of renting movies, and based on the reviews you've performed and put up on our site about past movies you viewed. Think about that. That's a whole new way of operating. Not going to the Blockbuster store and hoping that an associate might be able to offer a recommendation to you, but having personalized recommendations coming to your site all the time. Why couldn't Blockbuster replicate this when they finally went online many years later? Well, that was very, very difficult. By the time they moved to go online, several years after Netflix had already been there, they couldn't build those algorithms as easily. Netflix had been building this huge database for several years, and their predictive power of their statistical algorithms was quite high. Blockbuster now was playing catch-up. They didn't have that network effect going for them. Netflix's algorithms were getting better with each additional user. As more and more users used Netflix, there was more value to each new customer who could go there and say, wow, what a great personalized recommendation I've just received. Moreover, as Blockbuster eventually moved online, the customer they were trying to attract was initially the same customer they had catered to in their store, the soccer mom. But she was busy. She was much less likely to review movies or complete surveys as that young male living in his mother's basement. So they couldn't build algorithms as quickly and as effectively as Netflix had. A new business model upended the incumbent, not just a new product or service. So what should incumbent firms do? How should they react? Clay Christensen argued in his work on disruptive innovation that incumbent firms must separate a new unit trying to react to an upstart entrant. They have to create a separate subsidiary, wall them off from the mainstream business, and tell them to go after a new innovative opportunity in the market. Why? He argued that big companies eat their young, that it's very difficult. The mainstream unit will be so worried about protecting its profit margins and not seeing sales bleed off to this new innovation that they will essentially overwhelm this new idea. So separate it out, protect it from the rest of the business, and let them innovate. That was his argument. And he offered examples of this, like IBM, when they moved from the mainstream computer business to personal computers. They set up a separate business unit far away from their headquarters in New York and told them to go after this new opportunity. And at the time, it worked. Now, interestingly, there has been some criticism of these theories of disruptive innovation. In fact, just recently, in 2014, historian Joe Lepore wrote an article in The New Yorker, a harsh critique of Christensen's theory of disruptive innovation. It was a very harsh critique, even personal at times, and it received a lot of attention. But there was some validity. She critiqued some of the research methods and some of the applicability of the theory to a wide range of situations. She argued, in fact, that it had been applied in a wide range of industries, and perhaps it wasn't so widely applicable. Maybe you couldn't generalize quite as much as Christensen had done. What's my view on the critique? I think we have to be careful about this term disruptive innovation. We're hearing it all the time. It seems like it's in Fortune magazine and on the Wall Street Journal's pages every day. It's become something like a hammer, and we're looking for a nail to hammer in. It's an overused concept. Moreover, it's a very good descriptive tool. Looking back at a story like Netflix and Blockbuster, we can use the theory to explain Blockbuster's demise. But can we predict the future with the model? It's much more difficult to do. There's also this issue of two kinds of errors. You know, the error Christensen focuses on is the idea that incumbent firms sometimes miss the disruptive threat. They don't see it coming. But I think there's another kind of error that companies can make. They can make huge, misguided investments because they misperceive a threat. They begin to look at every new entrant as a potential disruptive innovator, and they start to throw huge dollars at lots of unproven technologies. That can be just as misguided as the blindness to a new idea that can happen when there's mental lock-in at an incumbent firm. You know, we have to be careful about the prescription that incumbent firms should separate units that are aiming to cope with a disruptive threat. I think that's the other thing that we have to be very careful about. You know, we talked about competitive advantage coming from an integrated system of activities. But if we separate out this new unit to go after a new idea, are we still going to have this integrated system of activities? Or will we have a disjointed firm? Will we have disconnects and not as powerful an advantage as a result? And we saw this, some of the misguided nature of this with Netflix itself when it perceived streaming as the next disruptive threat that might undermine its mail business. And so it tried to separate itself into two firms, and customers revolted. It was a simplistic response to a much more complicated problem. Now, what was the ultimate demise of Blockbuster? In fact, Netflix isn't the firm that put the stake through Blockbuster's heart. It was Redbox. Why? Think about what Redbox did. They said, well, interestingly, if Blockbuster is really about new releases, we can do new releases more effectively, more cost efficiently than Blockbuster can. We don't need a giant brick and mortar store to give the customer new releases. We can do it with vending machines in supermarkets and convenience stores. So now Blockbuster was faced with Redbox, a pure play new release business with vending machines. Netflix offering old movies via online technology. What was Blockbuster now trying to do in the late 2000s? They were straddling. They were trying to brick and click, be online and in the stores, and could do neither as well as the two pure plays, Redbox and Netflix. So your assignment as we close this lecture, I want you to think about two interesting businesses facing some disruptive innovation today. Consider the hotel and the taxi businesses. What's changing about these businesses in the last few years? Let me give you a hint. Think about Uber and Airbnb. If you haven't heard of those firms, go ahead and Google them and learn a little bit about what Uber and Airbnb are doing to the hotel and the taxi businesses. And ask yourself, what makes these firms such an imposing threat to the incumbent players?